my cousin Christina's favorite thing on earth is cherry pie. And she always asks me to make it. And now I'm finally doing it. So I have 6 cups of cherries. Now I use canned cherries because they're not in season right now. And I used a combination of red tart cherries and dark sweet cherries. So I don't have to add as much sugar because they're naturally sweet. So it took me 5 cans to get to 6 cups of cherries. I did 2 of the red tart and 3 of the dark and sweet. I'm going to pour those in a bowl. And then I'm going to add a cup of sugar. And then I'm going to gently toss the cherries in the sugar. And set those aside for an hour and let the cherries soak in that sugar and let the sugar pull out any moisture that's left in the cherries. So the next part of our cherry pie is I have a crust that, if you refer back to regular pie crust, is what I used. And it's in a 9-inch pie plate and in the refrigerator. So now I'm going to take the top. I want to make a lattice top for my cherry pie because it looks really pretty. So I'm going to roll this out into a 10 by 13 rectangle, adding flour as I need it. A perfect rectangle. So I'm going to cut off there. I cut it again right there. And now what I need are 8 strips. So I'm going to put 4 going each way, and then I'll show you how we braid them to make them latticed. So what I'm going to do is cut it about in half. Now the fun part is, if you break them, you just patch them together, because we're going to freeze these. Freezing them makes them easier to manage when you go to make your lattice crust. And we need to keep them just a little bit apart so they don't freeze together. And you know what? This one got cut off. So I'm going to roll out another and just make one tiny strip. There we go. So I have 8 strips of pie crust, and we're going to put this in the freezer for about 30 minutes, and then we'll be back. So our cherries have been soaking for a little over an hour. And you see all that juice that's in there? We're going to strain that out because you don't want a soggy pie. That's the last thing we want. So I've got my colander set over a bowl. I'm just going to pour this in. Set that aside. Now the reason I didn't do this over the sink is because I want to keep a 1/4 cup of that juice. Not all of it. Shake until we can get most of it out. I'm going to pour my drained cherries into a new bowl. And I'm going to measure out 1/4 of a cup of that sweet juice that we just drained. See all that's left? That's what we don't want. Now, I have 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1/4 teaspoon of almond extract. And then I have 1/4 cup of cornstarch. And the cornstarch is going to be your thickening agent so that your pie is not liquid. So I'm just going to toss with my hands to try to get it all mixed together. You could probably use a spoon, but I don't want to break up the cherries too much. Okay. And then I have my pie crust that was sitting in the refrigerator. So now I'm going to pour my cherries right inside. And now we have to put the lattice crust on, but first I have to get it out of the freezer. So here's our cherry pie. Here is our lattice strips, and they are frozen. So what I'm going to do is lay them down. We're going to start with 4. And then we are going to weave. So what I want to do is go under, over, under, and over. And then the opposite this way. And then we're going to let this warm up for a little bit so that we can create that nice crust on the end. So we're going to give it about 10-15 minutes to warm up, and then we'll piece that back together, and we'll be ready to bake our pie. So our pie crust has been allowed to soften up for about 15 minutes. Now I'm just going to cut around the edges with my culinary scissors and save that because pie crust is yummy. I'm going to cut all the way around the edges, and then I'm going to crimp it to create a border and to seal the 2 pie crusts together, the top and the bottom. And I'll show you how to do that. So what I'm going to do is pinch together. It's going to create a pretty border, and it's going to seal the 2 pie crusts so that you don't have one that flies up and becomes no longer attached. And if a little bit of juice spills out, that's okay. That's why we have it on our cookie sheet, so that if any juice spills out, it doesn't spill out and harm the bottom of the oven. And see, all the edges are crimped. This one looks a little. There we go. Okay. Now I have an egg white that I'm going to brush over the top of these little lattice pieces. There we go. And then I have a tablespoon of plain white sugar that I'm just going to sprinkle over the top. And this is going to give that crust just an extra little oomph. And it'll crystallize on the top, making the pie crust look really pretty. There we go. So I'm going to stick this in a 425-degree oven for 30 minutes, just to cook the top of the crust and get a nice golden brown. And then we're going to reduce the temperature, rotate the pan, and cook it at 375 for another 30 minutes. So you see the nice golden brown color? That's all we need. Now we're going to turn the pie around, close back up the oven, take the temperature down to 375 degrees, and cook it for another 30 minutes. So we cooked the pie for about 22 minutes at 425 degrees, and then we bumped it down to 375 and cooked it for another 20 minutes. You can go as long as 30, but my crust looked perfectly golden. The cherries looked nice and juicy, so I thought I'd stop there instead of burning everything. And here is our cherry pie.